Hello, welcome. My name is Nicole. Thanks for stopping by Family's Legacy today to learn all about death records. We'll cover a brief history of death records, the information they typically contain and how it applies to your research, how to search for, locate, and access the records, and lastly, I'll wrap it up by sharing 15 records other than a death certificate that will provide the information about your ancestor's death and more. A death record is just as it sounds, a record documenting the details and circumstances of a death, and it's usually one of the last and most recent records created for your ancestor, making it a good place to start. Death records are generally considered a primary source, though they can contain secondary information, which I addressed in a previous video about evaluating genealogy sources. They can really be a lifesaver if your ancestor was born during a time when birth records weren't kept, but lived until death records were, thus providing you with a birth date that you might not have found anywhere else. Recording deaths is an ancient practice that has produced a variety of death records over the centuries, created by different cultures and civilizations throughout history. In ancient Egypt, death records were kept on papyrus scrolls and provided information about the deceased, their cause of death, and their journey to the afterlife. The oldest death record in existence today that we know of dates back to ancient Egypt over 5,000 years ago and is a tomb with a hieroglyphic inscription detailing the deceased's name, death, and burial. In ancient Greece, death records were kept on tablets that documented the name, age, and cause of death of the deceased. Another form of ancient death records that predated the medieval era, so before 476 AD, is the lists of those who died in battle. We start to see a wider coverage of recording deaths across the world when parish registers were introduced during the Middle Ages, which are handwritten volumes kept in the local parish church, documenting religious ceremonies such as baptisms, marriages, and burials, and detailing the lives and relationships of the community. The oldest surviving parish registers in France date back to 1303. Parish registers were introduced in England and Wales in the 16th century, and churches would eventually begin supplying the state with copies of the parish registers for their own record keeping once their value was realized. Of course, when the Gutenberg Bible was first printed in Germany in the mid-1400s and the invention of the printing press allowed for mass production of the Bible, we eventually see the rise of the family Bible, which typically documents generations of vital events for a family, among other valuable information, and in some cases are the only record of death in existence for an ancestor. The Digital Public Library has reported that the earliest recorded date in their family Bible collection is for the birth of John Bullard in 1485. Family Bibles grew in popularity between the 17 and 1800s when the printing press had become more widespread, allowing for cheaper and faster production, and literacy rates were increasing while families were looking for ways to record their family history. There were even family Bible salesmen who would go door to door selling ornate versions to families during this family Bible boom. We start seeing even more regular record keeping of deaths outside of churches and home-kept records during the Middle Ages. For example, the authorities in 16th and 17th century London began publishing a mortality bill each week in response to recurring epidemics of the bubonic plague. Recording death certificates became more common in the 19th century, particularly in the Western countries with the introduction of public health policies and the need to track mortality rates. Prior to this time period, there really wasn't a standardized system in place for recording deaths, so many deaths had gone unrecorded before that. But once government started playing a more active role in public health and welfare, that standardized system took form, and in the United States, the first national effort to record deaths began in 1900, with general compliance by 1930. Prior to this effort, death registers were recorded at the local county courthouse, and before that, records of burial were recorded in church records. By the 20th century, the introduction of electronic systems for recording and storing vital statistics changed the way many countries store and provide access to their death records. And many now maintain centralized databases for these records. In many countries, death records are maintained by government agencies such as vital statistics offices or health departments. Some records can be accessed by the public, though there are certain restrictions on some records for privacy reasons, depending on the time and period and local laws. That's why it's important to have an understanding of the history and the type of records kept specifically for the time period and town, parish, or county where your ancestor died. And I've recommended familysearch.org's Research Wiki as a great resource to begin learning about that kind of information when you're just getting started. So what information can you find on a death record? Well, that will of course depend on the type of death record, but this here is a typical death certificate that you might find in the United States. And these records can contain a wealth of information about your ancestor, such as their name, including their maiden name if they were married, age at death, the date and location of their birth and death, their address, how long they were in that country or at that location for, marital status, details surrounding the death, such as the length of contributing illnesses and the cause of death, their occupation and possibly the name of their employer, the name of their spouse if they had one, the names and birthplaces of their parents, including the mother's maiden name, possibly a religious affiliation, the name and location of the mortuary and burial or cremation information. You might also see the names of other relatives listed as the informant or witnesses. There could also be an address given for the informant, which is the person who supplied the deceased's non-medical information for the death certificate. And typically, that's somebody who is related or close to the deceased. The signature of the attending physician who provided the medical details is also found on the record, along with the hospital information such as the name and maybe the address. Now that you've got some history and background information on death records, there are 4 questions you're going to want to ask yourself each time you're about to start searching for an ancestor's death certificate. The first question is, does it exist? You need to figure out if a death certificate exists for your ancestor by researching the specific time and place that they died. Be thorough in your research for death records when researching the time period and location. Just because death records weren't mandated at the state or province level when your ancestor died does not mean that the record doesn't exist at the county level or in church records, for example. In some countries that have a state church, the government often required churches to keep those records for years before the government eventually took over the task of recording deaths civilly. Now, let's say that you've researched the area and time for your ancestor and you've determined that death certificates were indeed recorded then and there. So the next question is, where are they held? Again, this will vary for the time period and the location, so you'll need to determine this on a case-by-case basis. Depending on the location and the time period, civil registration death records are kept on a national, state or province, county or town level, while church records are kept at the church parish level. Where the records are held will determine how you access the records. For United States research, keep in mind that death certificates are kept in the state where your ancestor died, not where they are buried. So, you know it exists, you know where it's located, now you want to figure out how to access it and if there are privacy restrictions. Thanks to digitization efforts over the years, many death records are now available online. Some state archives and libraries have online databases where you can search for death records, and others require you to manually search the records in person or by requesting a staff lookup. You may even need to make a written request to the church, archive, or government office where the records are located. Again, depending on the time and place of death, you might also find death certificates on popular genealogy sites such as Ancestry, familysearch, and MyHeritage. In some cases, depending on local privacy laws and whether you're an immediate family member of the deceased, you might be able to get a copy of the death record from Vital Check. It's not unusual for death records to have privacy restrictions, and they're generally kept private for 72 to 100 years depending on local laws. If you've searched city and county civil registrations and state archives and you can't find a civil registration death certificate for your ancestor, or one simply doesn't exist for that time and place, there are other death records that you can search for. We've briefly covered a few so far, like church records and family Bibles, but you can also search cemetery, tombstone and burial records, mortuary records, hospital records, obituaries, newspapers, published family histories, probate records, guardianship and estate papers, and mortality schedules. In the United States, there's a Social Security Death Index, which is updated monthly and is the only nationwide death index that's available. As you can see, there are a lot of different death records that you could potentially search for, and some of these, like the cemetery records, deserve their own video. So stay tuned for that, and happy researching, my fellow detectives.